They always slept during the day. By dawn the last of the townsfolk had gone indoors and the houses would be silent. Heat curtains locked across the windows as the sun rose over the deliquescing salt banks, filling the streets with opaque fire. Most of them were old people and fell asleep quickly in their darkened chalets, but Granger, with his restless mind in his one lung, often lay awake through the afternoons while the metal outer walls of the cabin creaked and hummed, trying pointlessly to read through the old logbooks Holiday had salvaged for him from the crashed space platforms. By 6 o'clock, the thermal fronts would begin to recede southward across the kelp flats. One by one, the air conditioners in the bedrooms switched themselves off. While the town slowly came to life, its windows opening to the cool dusk air, Granger strode down to the breakfast at the Neptune bar, gallantly doffing his sunglasses to left and right at the elderly couple settling themselves out on their porches, staring at each other across the shadow-filled streets. 5 miles to the north, the empty hotel at Idle End, Holiday usually rested quietly for another hour and listened to the coral towers, gleaming in the distance like white pagodas, sing and whistle as the temperature gradients cut through them. 20 miles away he could see the symmetrical peak of Hamilton, nearest of the Bermuda Islands, rising off the dry ocean floor like a flat-topped mountain, the narrow ring of white beach still visible in the sunset, a scum line left by a sinking ocean. That evening he felt even more reluctant than usual to drive down into the town. Not only would Granger be in his private booth at the Neptune, dispensing the same mixture of humour and homily, he was virtually the only person Holiday could talk to, and inevitably he had come to resent his dependence on the older man, but Holiday would have his final interview with the migration officer, make the decision which would determine his entire future. In a sense, the decision had already been made, as Ballard, the migration officer, had realised on his trip a month earlier. He did not bother to press Holiday, who had no special skills to offer, no qualities of character or leadership which would be of use on the new worlds. However, Ballard pointed out one small but relevant fact, which Holiday duly noted and thought over in the intervening month. Remember, Holiday, he warned him at the end of the interview in the requisitioned office at the rear of the sheriff's cabin, the average age of the settlement is over 60. In 10 years' time, you and Granger may well be the only two left here, and if that lung of his goes, you'll be on your own. He paused to let this prospect sink in, and then added quietly, all the kids are leaving out on the next trip. The Merryweather's 2 boys, Tom Duranda, fat lout, good riddance. Holiday thought to himself, look out, Mars. Do you realize you'll literally be the only one here under the age of 50? Katie Summers is staying, Holiday pointed out quickly, the sudden vision of a white organdy dress and long straw hair giving him courage. The migration officer had glanced at his application list and nodded obligingly. Yes, but she's just looking after her grandmother. As soon as the old girl dies, Katie will be off like a flash. After all, there's nothing to keep her here, is there? No, Holiday had agreed automatically. There wasn't now. For a long while he'd mistakenly believed there was. Katie was his own age, 22. The only person apart from Granger seemed to understand his determination to stay behind and keep watch over a forgotten Earth. But the grandmother died 3 days after the migration officer left, and the next day Katie had begun to pack. In some insane way, Holiday had assumed that she would stay behind, and what worried him was that all his assumptions about himself might be based on equally false premises. Climbing off the hammock, he went onto the terrace and looked out at the phosphorescent glitter of the trace minerals in the salt bank stretching away from the hotel. His quarters were in the penthouse suite on the 10th floor, the only heat-sealed unit in the building, but its steady settlement into the ocean bed had opened in the load walls wide cracks which would soon reach up to the roof. The ground floor had already disappeared. By the time the next floor went, 6 months at the outside, he would have been forced to leave the old pleasure resort and return to the town. Inevitably, that would mean sharing a chalet with Granger. A mile away, an engine droned. Through the dusk, Holiday saw the migration officer's helicopter whirling along toward the hotel, the only local landmark, then veer off once Ballard identified the town and brake slowly toward the landing strip. 8 o'clock, Holiday noted. His interview was at 8:30 the next morning. Ballard would rest the night with the sheriff, carry out his other duties as Graves Commissioner and Justice of the Peace, and then set off after seeing Holiday on the next leg of his journey. For 12 hours, Holiday was free, still able to make absolute decisions, or more accurately, not to make them. But after that, he would have committed himself. This was the migration officer's last trip, his final circuit from the deserted cities near St. Helena up through the Azores, and Bermudas, around to the main Atlantic ferry site at the Canaries. Only 2 of the big launching platforms were still in navigable orbit. Hundreds of others were continuously falling out of the sky. Once they came down, Earth was, to all intents, abandoned. From then on, the only people likely to be picked up would be a few military communications personnel. Twice on his way into the town, Holiday had to lower the salt plough fastened to the front bumper of the Jeep and ran back the drifts which had melted across the wide roadway during the afternoon. Mutating kelp, their gene shifts accelerated by the radiophosphorus reared up into the air on either side of the road like enormous cacti, turning the dark salt banks into a white lunar garden. But this evidence of the encroaching wilderness only served to strengthen Holiday's need to stay behind on Earth. Most of the nights, when he wasn't arguing with Granger at the Neptune, trying to explain his philosophy to him, he would drive around the ocean floor, climb over the crashed launching platforms, or wander with Katie Summers through the kelp forests. Sometimes he would persuade Granger to come with them, hoping that the older man's expertise, he had originally been a marine biologist, would help to sharpen his own awareness of the Baffy pelagic flora. But the original seabed was buried under the endless salt hills, and they might as well have been driving around the Sahara. As he entered the Neptune, a low cream and chromium saloon which abutted the landing strip and had formerly served as a passenger lounge when thousands of migrants from the southern hemisphere were being shipped up to the Canaries, Granger called out to him and rattled his cane against the window, pointing to the dark outline of the migration officer's helicopter parked on the apron 50 yards away. "I know," Holiday said in a bored voice as he went over with his drink. "Relax, I saw him coming." Granger grinned at him. Holiday, with his intent, serious face under an unruly thatch of blonde hair and his absolute sense of personal responsibility, always amused him. "You relax," Granger said, adjusting the shoulder pad under his Hawaiian shirt which disguised his sunken lung. He had lost it skin diving 30 years earlier. "I'm not going to fly to Mars next week." Holiday stared somberly into his glass. "I'm not either." He looked up at Granger's wry, saturnine face, and added sardonically, "Well, didn't you know?" Granger roared, tapping the window with his cane as if to dismiss the helicopter. "Seriously, you're not going? You've made up your mind?" "Wrong." "And right. I haven't made up my mind yet, but at the same time I'm not going. You appreciate the distinction?" "Perfectly, Dr. Schopenhauer." Granger began to grin again. He pushed away his glass. "You know, Holiday, your whole trouble is that you take yourself too seriously. You don't realize how ludicrous you are." "Ludicrous? Why?" Holiday asked guardedly. "What does it matter whether you've made up your mind or not? The only thing that counts now is to get together enough courage to head straight for the Canaries and take off into the wide blue yonder. For heaven's sake, what are you staying for? Earth is dead and buried. Past, present, and future no longer exist here. Don't you feel any responsibility to your own biological destiny?" "Spare me that." Holiday pulled a ration card from his shirt pocket and passed it across to Granger, who was responsible for the store's allocations. "I need a new pump in the lounge refrigerator, 30-watt Frigidaire. Any left?" Granger groaned, took the card with a snort of exasperation. "Good God, man, you're just a Robinson Crusoe in reverse, tinkering about with all these bits of old junk trying to fit them together. You're the last man on the beach who decides to stay behind after everyone else has left. Maybe you are a poet and a dreamer, but don't you realize that those two species are extinct now?" Holiday stared out at the helicopter on the apron, at the lights of the settlement, reflected against the salt hills that encircled the town. Each day they moved in a little further. Already it was difficult to get together a weekly squad to push them back. In 10 years' time his position might well be that of a Crusoe. Luckily the big water and kerosene tanks, giant cylinders the size of gasometers, held enough for 50 years. Without them, of course, he would have had no choice. "Let's give me a rest," he said to Granger. "You're merely trying to find me a justification for your own enforced stay. Perhaps I'm extinct, but I'd rather cling to life here than vanish completely. Anyway, I have a hunch that one day they'll be coming back. Someone's got to stay behind and keep alive a sense of what life here has meant. This isn't an old husk we can throw away when we're finished with it. We were born here. It's the only place you really remember." Granger nodded slowly. He was about to speak when a brilliant white arc crossed the darkened window, then soared out of sight, its point of impact of the ground lost behind one of the storage tanks. Holiday stood up and craned out of the window. Must be a launching platform. Looked like a big one, probably one of the Russians. A long rolling crump reverberated through the night air, echoing away among the coral towers. Flashes of light flared up briefly. There was a series of smaller explosions, and then a wide diffused pole of steam fanned out across the northwest. Lake Atlantic, Granger commented. Let's drive out there and have a look. May have uncovered something interesting. Half an hour later, with a set of Granger's old sample beakers, slides, and mounting equipment in the back seat, they set off in the jeep toward the southern tip of Lake Atlantic, 10 miles away. It was here that Holiday discovered the fish. Lake Atlantic, a narrow ribbon of stagnant brine 10 miles in length by a mile wide, for to the north of the Bermuda Islands, was all that remained of the former Atlantic Ocean, and was in fact the sole remnant of the oceans which had once covered 2/3 of the Earth's surface. The frantic mining of the oceans in the previous century to provide oxygen for the atmospheres of the new planets made their decline swift and irreversible. If their death had come climatic and other geophysical changes which ensured the extinction of Earth itself. As the oxygen extracted electrolytically from seawater was compressed and shipped away, the hydrogen released was discharged into the atmosphere. Eventually, only a narrow layer of denser oxygen-containing air was left, little more than a mile in depth. Those people remaining on Earth were forced to retreat into the ocean beds, abandoning the poisoned continental tables. At the hotel at Idle End, Holiday spent uncounted hours going through the library he had accumulated of magazines and books about the cities of the old Earth, and Granger often described to him his own youth when the seas had been half full and he had worked as a marine biologist at the University of Miami, a fabulous laboratory unfolding itself for him on the lengthening beaches. The seas are our corporate memory, he often said to Holiday. In draining them, we deliberately obliterated our own pasts, to a large extent our own self-identities. That's another reason why you should leave. Without the sea, life is unsupportable. We become nothing more than the ghosts of memories, blind and homeless, flitting through the dry chambers of a gutted skull. They reached the lake within half an hour and worked their way through the swamps which formed its banks. In the dim light, the grey salt dunes ran on for miles, their hollows cracked into hexagonal plates, a dense cloud of vapour obscuring the surface of the water. They parked on a low promontory by the edge of the lake and looked up at the great circular shell of the launching platform. This was one of the larger vehicles, almost 300 yards in diameter, lying upside down in the shallow water, its hull dented and burned. Riven by huge punctures where the power plants had torn themselves loose on impact and exploded off across the lake. A quarter of a mile away, hidden by the blow, they could just see a cluster of rotors pointing up into the sky. Walking along the bank, the main body of the lake on their right, he moved nearer to the platform, tracing out its riveted CCEP markings along the rim. The giant vehicle had cut enormous grooves through the nexus of pools just beyond the tip of the lake, and Granger waded through the warm water, searching for specimens. Here and there were small anemones and starfish, stunted bodies twisted by cancers. Web-like algae draped themselves over his rubber boots, their nuclei beating like jewels in the phosphorescent light. They paused by one of the largest pools, a circular basin 300 feet across, draining slowly as the water poured out through a breach in its side. Granger moved carefully down the deepening bank, forking specimens into the rack of beakers, while Holiday stood on the narrow causeway between the pool and the lake, looking up at the dark overhang off the space platform as it loomed into the darkness above him like the stern of a ship. He was examining the shattered airlock of one of the crew domes when he saw something suddenly move across the surface of the deck. For a moment he imagined that he had seen a passenger who had somehow survived the vehicle's crash, then realized that it was merely the reflection in the luminized skin of a ripple in the pool behind him. He turned around to see Granger, 10 feet below him, up to his knees in the water, staring out carefully across the pool. "Did you throw something?" Granger asked quietly. Holiday shook his head. "No." Without thinking, he added, "Must have been a fish jumping." "Fish? There isn't a single fish alive on the entire planet." The whole zoological class died out 10 years ago. Funny, though. Just then the fish jumped again. For a few moments, standing motionless in the half-light, they watched it together as its slim, silver body leaped frantically out of the tepid, shallow water, its short, glistening arcs carrying it to and fro across the pool. "Dogfish," Granger muttered. "Shark family. Highly adaptable. Would need to be to have survived here. Damn it, it may well be the only fish still living." Holiday moved down the bank, his feet sinking in the oozy mud. "Isn't the water too salty?" Granger bent down and scooped up some of the water, sipped it tentatively. "Saline, but comparatively dilute." He glanced over his shoulder at the lake. "Perhaps there's continuous evaporation off the lake's surface and local condensation here. A freak distillation couple." He slapped Holiday on the shoulder. "Holiday, this should be interesting." The dogfish was leaping frantically toward them. its 2-foot body twisting and flicking. Low mud banks were emerging all over the surface of the pool, and only a few places toward the centre was the water more than a foot deep. Holiday pointed to the breach in the bank 50 yards away, gestured Granger after him, and began to run toward it. 5 minutes later, they had effectively dammed up the breach. Then Holiday returned for the jeep and drove it carefully through the winding saddles between the pools. He lowered the ramp and began to force the sides of the fish pool in toward each other. After 2 or 3 hours, he had narrowed the diameter from 100 yards to under 60, and the depth of the water had increased to over 2 feet. The dogfish had ceased to jump and swam smoothly just below the surface, snapping at the countless small plants which had been tumbled into the water by the jeep's ramp. Its slim white body seemed white and unmarked, the small fins trim and powerful. Granger sat on the hood of the jeep, his back against the windshield, watching Holiday with admiration. "You obviously have hidden reserves," he said ungrudgingly. "I didn't think you had it in you." Holiday washed his hands in the water and stepped over the churned mud which formed the boundary of the pool. A few feet behind him the dogfish veered and lunged. "I want to keep it alive," Holiday said matter-of-factly. "Don't you see, Granger, the fish stayed behind when the first amphibians emerged from the sea 200 million years ago, just as you and I, in turn, are staying behind now. In a sense, all fish are images of ourselves seen in the sea's mirror." He slumped down on the running board. His clothes were soaked and streaked with salt, and he gasped at the damp air. To the east, just above the long bulk of the Florida coastline, rising from the ocean floor like an enormous aircraft carrier, were the first dawn thermal fronts. "Will it be all right to leave until this evening?" Granger climbed into the driving seat. "Don't worry. Come on, you need a rest." He pointed at the overhanging rim of the launching platform. "That should shade it for a few hours, help to keep the temperature down." As they neared the town, Granger slowed to wave at the old people retreating from their porches, fixing the shutters on the steel cabins. "What about your interview with Ballard?" he asked Holiday surlily. "He'll be waiting for you. Leave here? After last night? It's out of the question." Granger shook his head as he parked a car outside the Neptune. "Aren't you rather overestimating the importance of one dogfish? There were millions of them once. They were the vermin of the sea. You're missing the point," Holiday said, sinking back into the seat, trying to wipe the salt out of his eyes. "That fish means that there's still something to be done here. Earth isn't dead and exhausted after all. We can breed new forms of life, a completely new biological kingdom." Eyes fixed on this private vision, Holiday sat holding the steering wheel while Granger went into the bar to collect a crate of beer. On his return, the migration officer was with him. Ballard put a foot on the running board, looked into the car. "Well, how about it, Holiday? I'd like to make an early start. If you're not interested, I'll be off. There's a rich new life out there. It's the first step to the stars. Tom Duranda and the Murray River boys are leaving next week. Do you want to be with them?" "Sorry," Holiday said curtly. He pulled the crate of beer into the car and let out the clutch, then gunned the jeep away down the empty street in a roar of dust. Half an hour later, as he stepped out onto the terrace at Idle End, cool and refreshed after his shower, he watched a helicopter roar overhead, its black propeller scudding, then disappear over the kelp flats toward the hull of the wrecked space platform. "Come on, let's go. What's the matter?" "Hold it," Granger said. "You're getting overeager. Don't interfere too much. You'll kill the damn thing with kindness. What have you got there?" He pointed to the can Holiday placed in the dashboard compartment. "Breadcrumbs," Granger sighed, and gently closed the door. "I'm impressed. I really am. I wish you'd look after me this way. I'm gasping for air, too." They were 5 miles from the lake when Holiday leaned forward over the wheel and pointed to the crisp tire prints in the soft salt flowing over the road ahead. "Someone's there already." Granger shrugged. "What of it? They've probably gone to look at the platform." He chuckled quietly. "Don't you want to share the new Eden with anyone else? Or just you alone and a consultant biologist?" Holiday laughed. "Those platforms annoy me, the way they're hurled down as if Earth were a garbage dump. Still, if it wasn't for this one, I wouldn't have found the fish." They reached the lake and made their way toward the pool, the erratic track of the car ahead winding in and out of the pools. 200 yards from the platform it had been parked, blocking the route for Holiday and Granger, its passengers having gone ahead on foot. "That's the Murray River's car," Holiday said as they walked around the big stripped-down Buick, slashed with yellow paint and fitted with sirens and pennants. "The 2 boys must have come out here." Granger pointed. "One of them's up on the platform." The younger brother had scaled onto the rim and was shouting down like an umpire at the antics of 2 other boys, one his brother, the other Tom Duranda, a tall, broad-shouldered youth in his space cadet's jerkin. They were standing at the edge of the fish pool, stones and salt blocks in their hands, hurling them into the pool. Leaving Granger, Holiday sprinted on ahead, shouting at the top of his voice. Too preoccupied to hear him, the boys continued to throw their missiles into the pool, while the younger Murray Rivers egged them on from the platform above. Just before Holiday reached them, Tom Duranda ran a few yards along the bank and began to kick the mud wall into the air, and resumed his target throwing. "Duranda, get away from there!" Holiday bellowed. "Put those stones down!" He reached Duranda as the youth was about to hurl a brick-sized lump of salt into the pool, seized him by the shoulder and flung him round, knocking the salt out of his hand and into his shoulder hand into a shoulder of damp crystals, then lunged at the elder Merrill boy, kicking him away. The pool had been drained. A deep breach had been cut through the bank, and the water had poured out into the surrounding gullies and pools. Down in the centre of the basin, in a litter of stones and spattered salt, was the crushed but still wriggling body of the dogfish, twisting itself helplessly in the bare inch of water that remained. Dark red blood poured from wounds in its body, staining the salt. Holiday held himself at Duranda, shook the youth savagely by the shoulders. "Duranda, do you realise what you've done, you exhausted?" Holiday released him and staggered down into the centre of the pool, kicked away the stones, and stood looking at the fish, twitching spasmodically at his feet. "Sorry, Holiday," the older Merrill boy said tentatively behind him. "We didn't know it was your fish." Holiday waved him away, then let his arms fall limply to his sides. He felt numbed and baffled, unable to resolve his anger and frustration. Tom Duranda suddenly began to laugh and shouted something derisively. Their tension broke, and the boys turned and ran off together across the dunes and toward their car, yelling and playing catch with each other, mimicking Holiday's heart rage. Granger let them go by, then walked across to the pool, wincing when he saw the empty basin. "Holiday," he called. "Come on, man." Holiday shook his head, his eyes staring at the beaten body of the fish. Granger stepped down the bank to him. Sirens hooted in the distance as the Buick roared off. "Those damn children." He took Holiday gently by the arm. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "but it's not the end of the world." Bending down, Holiday reached toward the fish. Lying still now, the mud around it sleek with blood, his hands hesitated, then retreated. "Nothing we can do, is there?" he said impersonally. Granger examined the fish. Apart from the large wound in its side and the flattened skull, the skin was intact. "Why not have it stuffed?" he suggested seriously. Holiday stared at him incredulously, his face contorting. For a moment he said nothing. Then, almost berserk, he shouted, "Have it stuffed? Are you crazy? Do you think I want to make a dummy of myself, fill my own head with straw?" Turning on his heel, he shouldered past Granger and swung himself roughly out of the pool.